All right, well, we're turning now to Warren and the fact that Warren has one of the highest rates of court-ordered evictions in the country. It's part of a bigger conversation around housing insecurity, not only here in Warren, but in Southeast Michigan. And Stephen, you actually led an interesting discussion here in Warren over the summer as part of WDET's book club. What was the book and kind of what was the situation?
Yeah, well, we decided to read as a community together Evicted by Matthew Desmond, which is a really riveting book about how evictions drive poverty in the city of Milwaukee. He spent a couple of years basically living with families who bounce around all the time because they keep getting put out of their homes. We thought that was a really great foundation to have a conversation about housing insecurity here in Southeast Michigan. Evictions, foreclosures, tax foreclosures, senior housing. Think of all the issues that we have here with making sure people have a home. And so we had meetings in several different places, had a lot of folks turn out. The one here in Warren, we did talk specifically about those court-ordered evictions, which is a particular dynamic here, and we're going to have more on that issue this fall.
Let's go ahead and take a look at what people had to say.
Warren's changing. Warren's changing a lot. It's a very different community than it was when I was a kid growing up in Detroit. And I would imagine that there are a lot of issues that have come up in the last 10, 15 years that may be new to Warren.
It's an economic situation. When I graduated from high school 45 years ago, I could have walked out of that door of high school, got a job in a manufacturing plant, that I could have lived in any neighborhood I wanted to. The United States now is less than 13% unionized employees. We have archaic labor laws where an employee trying to organize on a job generally gets fired. Employers paid below the minimum wage or minimum wage. You can't sustain a livelihood or living in a house when you're making $8, $9 an hour.
I'll add a little note about minimum wage. The Alice report from the United Way, which we talk about on the show sometimes, suggests that life is pretty much unlivable in Southeast Michigan with anything less than $20 an hour.
Yeah.
And that you are living check to check, paycheck to paycheck in a really tough way with anything less than $20 an hour.
And think of how many jobs you can name that don't pay people $20 an hour. $20 an hour is a lot, actually, if you're talking about unskilled labor.
Yes, I'm a landlord.
That was what I was just going to ask.
It's almost always about non-payment of rent. I don't know any landlord that likes to be between customers. Oh, let me also say, it's very expensive to be poor.
That's a great way.
Most everything costs more, from car insurance, car payments, food. But just as important, now we have a bunch of people from our municipality here, and I'd like to point out a couple things. By Michigan statute,
Go ahead.
the taxes are twice as high for a rental property as they are for a homeowner.
For a home.
So right away, you're going to have more just by Michigan state statutes.
And because the property taxes are higher, that means the rent has to be higher.
Well, it affects the rent. So there's a lot of costs that are really high and going higher for insurance, for taxes, for a lot of things, just to own the property.
Right.
So poor people are going to pay more, period.
A lot of commonalities are that each of the persons, even that are described in the book, have not only the very severe housing insecurities, but along with that, they are not getting good medical treatment, mental health treatment, or substance abuse treatment. And those things just dovetail in. And if they did not have mental health, physical health, or substance abuse treatments before they were evicted, they come shortly after being evicted or within a very short period of time.
One of the big things that really needs to happen is just people started to talk about it and bringing it to light that this is not because people are lazy, this is not because landlords are slumlords. There's a whole bunch of different things going on in here, and I think you need to look at each individual issue and see, where did that come from and how can we help to try to stem this off a little bit.
What really struck me is when you heard from the landlord who sat and said, look, it's very expensive to be poor, and that he feels that there are so many different policies in place that their hands are tied as well.
Yeah. We heard from a lot of landlords during this book club. At each event, there were landlords who showed up to talk about their side of the story and to sort of complicate that picture of the ogre-like slumlord who's just putting people out because they can't pay. They have a side of the story too, and often they go to extremes to try to keep people in their homes, even though they can't pay or can't pay the full rent. Really, this is a reflection of poverty is the problem. People live paycheck to paycheck. They just barely get what they need each month to be able to pay all their bills, and they fall behind or something happens, and they're often out of luck.
No.
And these municipalities do think they can bleed a landlord. Taxes are way higher on a rental property, and the community
means
say,
that rent is
well,
higher.
that's taking it out of the landlord's pocket. No, the landlord's passing that on, and so rents go up. Insurance is higher. There are a lot of additional costs. If rental homes were taxed at the rate of regular homes, rents would come down, and particularly at that lower level, that lower housing level.
And you look at the systemic kind of ripple effect of when someone then is evicted from their home, and then what they are able to do or what they're not able to do from there. It affects so many other aspects.
Yeah, well, we just saw the report in Bridge magazine and Chalkbeat about mobility in Detroit schools.
Which is a great read.
Half of that problem is driven by people losing their homes and having to move across the city. If you think of the other issues that you see in cities like Detroit, especially with poverty, a lot of them are driven by this housing insecurity that people have. Instability in where you live causes instability elsewhere.
And now there's a housing shortage as well. So if you're a landlord, during the recession years, if you're a landlord and your house came open, you rode with your tenant for several months because you knew that if he or she left,
Couldn't
you
get someone
might not
else.
get somebody else in. Now there's such a demand for housing, such a shortage of housing, particularly at the lower cost levels.
Right.
Somebody moves, somebody stops paying the rent, you've got to work with them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or I'm sorry, you've got to get them out of there because there's somebody else knocking in at the
Who
door
wants
who
the
wants
house.
in.
Which I also think is another offshoot that we need to look at is the stress and trauma it puts on kids. And so that's another part of the issue when you're talking about education and can kids achieve, and sometimes that they're so far behind even getting to school because of the stress and trauma that they have undergone in that kind of change
Yes.
of housing and of living. We're going to continue to talk about this.